Hello, everyone, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Roxy.
I'm Faith Flanagan with the Buckminster Fuller Institute, the Living Systems Collaboratory, and the Design Science Studio. Welcome.
Welcome. If you're tuning in for the first time and you're not familiar with what the Living Systems Art and Design Collaboratory is, we are really looking forward to a beautiful day together. First, we'll let you know a little bit more about the program. So the Living Systems Art and Design Collaboratory is presented by the Design Science Studio at the Buckminster Fuller Institute in partnership with Habitual and the Emergent Media and Design Lab at the University of California, Irvine. This program is providing funding and scaffolding for artists and designers to support the development of their creative projects that are exploring living systems. The Collaboratory is working with a cohort to design projects that aid people in perceiving the biological, cognitive, social, ecological, philosophical, spiritual, mathematical, political, and technological dimensions of life as a unified whole, as inspired by living systems. The Living Systems Art and Design Collaboratory, as we mentioned, is this wonderful partnership and is supported by the patronage of Mansour Vakili, who is a systems philosopher and a deep believer in helping to share the power that our biological systems have and biomimetic structures in helping to rethink the way that our human systems are designed, and really believes in the power of art and design as a language that can surpass and support a deeper understanding and a shift in the way that we're relating with our more than human world and building our structures forward. And there's an incredible mentor team that's supporting the members of the Collaboratory, including Faith and myself, and many other wonderful individuals without whom the Collaboratory members wouldn't have quite as much support. So we're really extending our deep gratitude to all who are involved. And the Design Science Studio is an educational incubator for the art of the Regeneration. So what the Design Science Studio does is we empower a global cohort of creators who are directing their creative outputs towards a world that works for 100% of life. And so they're in their 7th month now of the program, and we'll be having a launch at the end of March, which will soon be announced. Go ahead and mark your calendars, March 21st to the 28th. We're launching the Design Science Decade, the movement, the Regeneration, and a decade-long initiative that is kind of mimicked in Buckminster Fuller's Design Science Decade. So we're so lucky to be in partnership with the Buckminster Fuller Institute and presenting all of this through and with his legacy. Faith, would you like to speak a little bit more to the decade?
So the decade consists of 5 different phases, consisting of reconciliation, restoration, regeneration, restoration. Sorry, I'm a little on the spot and I don't have anything out, but maybe you can speak more to it.
Yeah, no, reconciliation and reenchantment, I think, were the other 2. Right. But the decade, is really this reemergence of the decade that Buckminster Fuller saw was possible from 1965 to 1975. He said, we made all the right tools for all the wrong reasons. And we really have everything that we need in the course of a decade to retool the way that we're operating to make the world work for all and not just some, through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense to the disadvantage of anyone. So we're reinvigorating this vision, knowing that we can turn things together as a powerful force in this world through cooperating. And so that's the mission, the revolution that the Design Science Studio and the Decade are really supporting. And as a part of all of this, we are supporting creators and designers of all kinds, all ages, across the world, to really find the sweet spot between their passions, their missions, their professions, their vocations, to work together and kind of empower their unique essence in the world. And this program is focused on projects that are specifically related to living systems in some way. And so 30 of the projects in the Design Science Studio that are focused on living systems are the ones in the Living Systems Collaboratory. And there are many other projects across the studio that are focused on a myriad of other sectors and kind of ways of applying the important direction that we need to think into and create forward for, to really build bridges to have a future that works for all and not just some everything from climate change, regenerative soil, and regenerating our inner landscapes, and creating new community platforms, and so many powerful projects across the world supporting shifting the way that we're relating with our world to kind of come into equilibrium. So that's a little bit about the program and kind of what's bringing us here today. And we're so honored to have Jeff Sue with us today, who's our guest. We're doing a guest seminar with Jeff as a part of the Collaboratory. So we're so happy to have you here, Jeff. And I will pass it over to Faith to intro you more.
Yeah, welcome, Jeff. Again, we're really, really excited to have you, to hear from you today. Jeff Sue is a managing director of nRhythm, which is an organizational design firm working on creating regenerative design communities. He's also a doctor. Dr. Jeff Sue has led a diverse international career as an ecologist, academic, executive director, consultant, and psychotherapist in the US, Australia, Europe, and Africa. Throughout his career, Jeff has applied systems thinking and holistic approaches to help organizations address the most pressing environmental and social issues of our time. He applies systems thinking to his own life and experience through a dedicated Buddhist practice, and he holds a PhD in ecology and environmental science and a graduate degree in holistic psychology. That's incredible, Jeff. And today, Jeff will be speaking to lost it. Yeah, 1 second. What is life anyway? Oh, there we go. So his talk is called "What is Life Anyways?" As we begin to redesign our communities, agriculture, organizations, economy, and governments with life in mind, we need to ask what we really mean by life. Which aspects of life in living systems are we modeling? The light reflection of a hummingbird's wing, the Fibonacci sequence pattern of a snail's shell on a fiddlehead fern. Or is it the ecological relationship to symbiotic, mutualism, or predator-prey relationships? This question is more than just an academic philosophical one, where we are considering life as a model for design. In this lecture, Jeff will present nRhythm's synthesis of exploration of what is life in our holistic regenerative design framework, which is being used by organizations, networks, and communities around the world to address some of our most complex social and ecological issues of our time. Wow, welcome, Jeff. I'm so excited.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Roxy. Thank you, Faith, and thank you everyone who's tuning in. So really honored to be here.
We're honored to have you. It's perfect timing too. For anyone who didn't tune in last week, we've had some really great, or the last few weeks, we've had some amazing different artists who are working at the intersection of art and science and climate. And before that, we had Fritjof Capra. And Jeff, it's just so valuable to have all of your insights and your unique perspective. So thank you for coming to join us. It's going to be an amazing day.
Great. Thank you so much. Shall I take it away from here?
Take it
Go
away.
for it.
Great. So again, thank you. I'm so honored to be part of the group of amazing speakers that are part of this series. Incredibly honored. And I also want to say what I'll be presenting today is really a collective effort of everyone at nRhythm. So just want to introduce that nRhythm is a product. Trey and Alex and Jen, who's on the call actually in the chat. She's heckling me already, I see, I think in the comments. And just want to say I'm representing them today and representing a lot of the amazing thinking that I will try to bring together and try to present. So we, we're all here as designers, as artists, as in many different contexts, and it's an incredibly exciting time to be thinking about designing with life in mind. Of course, that was, Buckminster Fuller's, the foundation and a leading thinker and such a, ahead of his time in this. And I think we're at an exciting time, and it's incredibly interesting to this question of what is life actually is incredibly rich. On one level, it's really intuitive and we get it. We walk out in life, we're in life, we want to be in life, we want to be in forests and nature places. But when we get down to really designing with this in mind, what do we really mean by life? And that's what we'll focus a little bit on in this talk. So great. Just a little bit about nRhythm. Our purpose for coming together as a team is we see ourselves as really transforming how we work in a way that releases unlimited potential while being in rhythm with all of life. And we really work with individuals, teams, organizations, networks, and communities. And what we see as the fruition of this is the ability for everyone, all communities and all contexts to experience abundance and resilience now and into the future. We were founded in 2009 by Trey Cates and Jen Cates as an international organizational design and management firm. Our team represents 50 years of combined experience thinking through what do we mean by operating and resourcing organizations to address some of the most pressing social and environmental issues. We're blessed to have clients and partners and a community that really spans 6 continents. And we invite you all to join us, and we want to meet you all. And I hope everyone who's tuning in today, these are unprecedented times, unprecedented challenging times. And thank you for taking the time. And I hope you are all doing as well as possible in your own well-being and in your own community during these times. So I want to talk a little bit about organizational design and what we mean about organizational design. It's kind of a cold sounding term, but we think of this extremely broadly. And so we think of an organization as really any group of individuals coming together to achieve some common purpose. So we're really aligned with this quote from Douglas North. And we think of design as also really fundamentally about any time we are arranging elements together, even just 2 elements together in a way to accomplish a particular purpose. And so we see our work really being applied to many, many different contexts. Organizations can be a small group of people, a small community. Design can be just having a shared purpose. And I know many of us are coming together with really big purposes of trying to transform our governments, agriculture systems, economic systems, and these are big tasks and really honorable tasks. And if we are doing this, then if we think of organizations really broadly and design is really broadly, then we are all part of a really big metaphor, whether we know it or not, a really powerful metaphor. And so if we ask, what is the most dominant design metaphor for organizations currently? A quick Google search, you just say, like, how do I run my business better, or how do I run my organization better? Inevitably comes up with all kinds of images like this. This is truly the top 3 hits when I Googled this question. And we see your machine as a business with lots of gears and departments as gears, running your business as a machine, running like a well-oiled machine. This machine metaphor for organizing ourselves to achieve really anything is so dominant. We just inherit it no matter what kind of organization we join or try to create. It's true in all contexts for everything and scales. Something as large as the economic, economy of a whole state like Georgia being referred to as an engine, or in the philanthropic sector or impact sector. This is, thinking of a framework for building a cross-sector leadership practice. We see gears everywhere. And it's actually deeply embedded in the language we use, right? The language we probably use every day. Maybe if people are brave, you can say, how many people in the chat have one of you used one of these terms recently in the last couple months or weeks, working like a well-oiled machine, or saying, I don't have bandwidth for that, referring to our own time and resources as the equivalent, the analogy of internet access and ones and zeros and a wire, or we've got that dialed in, or we move the needle. Actually, in Rhythm, we just started like the equivalent of a swear jar. So when we find one of us using sort of a mechanistic term just out of reflex, then we gotta put some money in the swear jar. So in the mechanistic jar, and we point to this because language is so powerful, right? It refers to what are the sort of subconscious or even conscious mental models that we are designing with. And so the consequences of this, of course, is if we're thinking of our organizations as machines, how are we thinking of ourselves? That means we're thinking of ourselves as parts of a machine, and not just any kind of part, but what type of part. I've had lots of old used cars, they break down, and what do? You just replace that part with an identical part or even a cheaper part, right? I'm not going to pay for the factory OEM version, I'm going to pay for a generic version. And so if we are coming together with these deep purposes and viewing ourselves and viewing our coworkers as expendable, replaceable parts, this has lots of consequences. And there's many ways to think about these consequences, and in these challenging times, they're probably all part of our everyday lives. But at a systemic level, we know, and many of us are gathered here today because we believe this metaphor, this machine metaphor, is really at the root of some really systemic global issues. So we think of it, this machine model is not helping us when we think of how our planet is doing. And there's many ways to think of this: climate and equity, but certainly from a habitat loss, there's one way to think about it. This is the estimated habitat loss as of 2009 globally. From an economic perspective, we're at a place where individuals now have more net worth than entire countries. And this is a few years old again from 2016. I think Mr. Bezos has moved himself up this rung, especially with his local, his last announcements. And so something is clearly broken here, where we have individuals having more net worth than entire countries on the globe. And from an equity perspective, this is a US-based perspective, but probably true in many parts of the world. In the US, this is a slide from our colleagues and partners at Race Forward, that race is still the #1 predictor, even if you correct for gender, for class, for socioeconomic class, of your access and your success in every single one of these areas. From your access to education, how you're treating criminal justice, access to health, environment, housing. We see this as directly linked to this machine metaphor, or I just saw in the chat, you could easily make a close connection to a colonization, decolonization framework, of course, with this metaphor. And how is it actually just working for actual productivity or for people and in organizations? And it's also not working well. Gallup puts out a poll every year and find that only 13% consider themselves engaged with their work. 63% are sort of passively not engaged, and 24% are actually actively disengaged, which includes active sabotage of the organization that they are working for. And Gallup has a context of economic productivity, estimates that this is costing the US economy between $450 and $550 billion a year in lost productivity. So we are clearly in a design, this is a design issue. We see this as a design issue at nRhythm. And so it's really great to be part of this lecture series. And so we know we need new models, right? We've inherited this model of running ourselves like machines. Really, where did this come from? And it came from this, time of the quote unquote Enlightenment in Europe, this idea that the world works like this giant clock, right? It works like this mechanistic clock, and it's referred to often as the Clockwork Universe. In many ways, we can blame Newton. In fact, Newton did such an unbelievably amazing job of using this mechanistic reductionist approach to be able to say that there are common patterns and principles related to movements of bodies, right? Everything from an apple falling out of a tree, whether that's a real story or not, to now today there's a Mars landing right after this call. I think there's a live streaming of a Mars landing. So the same principles are being still used for all of that technology, and of course the movements of the planets. And the issue is that we just assume that this approach, which was so empowering at the time, right, the ability to observe and predict through reduction and reason, was deeply disruptive at the time, disrupting this view of the world as being created by fate and divine rights in Europe, primarily. And it really became the philosophical foundation for democracy and human rights, social justice in quote unquote Western civilization. Of course, there's many civilizations predating this that had a different metaphor. But I say it's Newton's fault because these were so convincing, and it's so the idea that these same universal principles and patterns could be applied. The mistake we made is that we've spent the next 300 years thinking that all these other human endeavors could be approached in a similar way, right? And the issue is, of course, is that not everything is as simple as physics, as the movements of bodies in space. And so there's lots of different formulations of this idea, but there are just different kinds of problems. And so we've pulled a couple of those together to say there are simple problems like baking a cake, where you have an ingredients list and a recipe. You can follow the series of known steps. There's some assumptions. Those of you living in high elevations know this. There's some assumptions you need to take into account to adjust that recipe. But in general, you get really repeated results. And actually, something like the Mars landing today or sending a rocket to the moon, it's a complicated problem. But in many ways, it's very similar to a simple problem. It's just many simple problems put together. It's similar that you have known inputs, you have design blueprints, you can follow some series of known steps, and the known assumptions are manageable, and you have repeated results, right? We have SpaceX now, we have other countries, we have many who can also build a rocket. It's complicated, and there's lots of steps to take into account. It's precise, but it's very different than another type of problem, which is that of a complex problem. And we often synonymously use complex and complicated, but complex is something very different. So if we take something like raising a child, it's a very different type of problem, right? Because each situation is completely different. There's lots of interdependent inputs. There's really a set of unknown next steps. There's a certain pattern you can follow, but there's all kinds of different unknown assumptions and unintended consequences. And so the outcomes quickly become unpredictable. And so if we take this mechanistic model that works really well for simple problems, works really well for complicated problems, it just doesn't really work well for complex problems. And this was recognized by, many of the seminal systems thinkers, of course, recognized by Buckminster Fuller, and Donella Meadows' quote is really spot on, right, in this. It says the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system, but we treat it as if it were not. We treat it as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And so we think we are really in the middle of another shift in perception. And I hope we don't look back on this time as the digital age or the Facebook age or the millennial age of even though all those things are very persistent in our time. We really think we're going to look back, if we are still here to look back, as the age of complexity. It's going to be the age that whether we got it right, whether we figured out a way to manage ourselves, to manage our communities and our governments and our nations and our families, to embrace complexity or not. Because I think many of us are here recognizing that if we don't get this right, everything we're being challenged by today is going to be continuing to accelerate, and we may not be here to name this age. And so, of course, all of you are here, many of us are here because we see life as this really promising, of course, different model, not just promising, but vital model to look at, instead of this machine metaphor. But what do we really mean by life then? At some levels, it's so intuitive, but if we're really looking to design with life in mind, what do we mean? And here's a quick comic that I found. It says, which of these animals inspires your success strategy, right? You can I rely on myself in complex strategies for success, or my group relies on loyalty to each other for our success, or look, I hope we are all succeed, but if there's any trouble, I'm out of here. This is probably not, it's humor. It's probably not very honorable to the wonderful three-toed sloth, but sloth saying, dude, I'm just trying not to fall out of this tree. And we point this out because, of course, if we are thinking of designing with life in mind, it's not a specific aspect of life, but really life as a whole, life as a system. And so we need to be thinking about how we really are modeling ourselves. What aspects of design of life are we really interested in? And so we need to look at models for life as a whole, or what is life. And again, these are not all equally robust or equally valid, perhaps, to design after. So here's a very popular view of what life is. My wife is from South Africa. I've actually been lucky enough to visit Pride Rock in Kenya. But this is a really dominant metaphor for life, this idea of a circle of life. And there's lots of issues about this that are problematic. Of course, there's lots of issues of Disney that are problematic. But even as a kid, when I was watching this, I said, I don't get it. Why are all these prey animals just so happy about this arrival of a new king of a species that would, once it gets hungry, rip all their throats out, right? And our kids even ask this. I have parents that watch this movie, and their kids ask this. It's like, it's the circle of life, right? There's a song about it, but we don't really go deeper into what that really means. And of course, what we're really looking at is not circles of life, but the idea that there are cycles in life. There are balancing dynamic equilibriums of predator and prey, whether you look at bean weevils and wasps or moose and wolves. And of course, it's easy to pick on Disney. What they don't want us to think about is this is the balancing factor in this quote unquote circle of life, right? And what is the perspective of the individual prey animal in this? What are we designing for then? What are we modeling? And you'll see throughout my presentation, I think humor is a wonderful form of information, a wonderful sort of signal in the world. And this is recognized. This is a designer of toys from New Zealand called the Adorable Circle of Life. And these are actually inflatable things you can buy, and they are all a predator munching on a really cute prey animal in some way, and it's pointing and satirizing that something is incomplete about this circle of life view of what life is. So to the question of the talk, what is life then anyways? So we're going to want to do something a little interactive here. We're going to explore this together. And this is actually something I did when I taught introductory biology classes. This is something I would start our biology class with. Biology, of course, is Latin for the study of life. And so we'd start with this exercise. It's called the game of two lists, and we're going to break it down in an interactive way. But basically, we're going to go through a series of lists and determine, first ask ourselves, which of these things do we consider to be life and which is non-life? And more importantly, why? So ask you to interact in the chat here. Go ahead and put your vote in. Which of these things do you consider to be alive? Both are alive. Great. Baby. Yep. Another vote for both. Okay. Another word for both. Rock is getting a lot of love. Both are getting a lot of love. A lot of vitalists in our group here. Okay, I'll make it a little harder for you. If you had to choose one of these things to keep alive, then, for those of you who are saying both, which one would you be forced to choose? Yeah, most of us at a gut level see some difference between what we consider or what we value life in versus even if we see life in both of these things. Now here's the harder question. Whatever choice you made, why did you make that? What is the one, if you had to come up with one criteria to say why I said a rock is alive and a baby, or why I said a rock is not alive and a baby is alive, or why I said both, what is your one criteria that satisfies both objects, right? So if I said all living things eat pizza, it would work because the rock doesn't have the ability to eat pizza. The baby may not be good for the baby, but it could physically eat pizza. So that's the kind of criteria we're looking for. Great. Awareness. Nice. Animate. Emotional bond. Beautiful. Breath. Nothing. Great. Very good. Okay, we're gonna go on to the next version of this. How about these two things? Which one of these is alive and which one is not alive? Any votes? Both again. Great. And then similarly, we'll jump straight to what are your criteria here for saying both are alive or one is not alive? Oh, sorry, yes, and that's those are seeds. It's seeds in a crystal if it's not clear. Seed sprout. Both are made of bacteria. Crystal's not made of bacteria, but great. May have bacteria in it or on it. Very good. And one last one. A woman after menopause and a girl before reproduction is reproductive ability. I'll go ahead and show the next one as well. Go ahead, put your thoughts in. Both. Great. And again, your criteria. Here now we really get into a ethical question. What do we consider death to be? What decisions are we made around death? So 10 minutes after brain function has ended, that's still the legal definition of death, or a medically induced coma. Great. Thank you for playing along. And as many of you are already aware, I'm forcing you into a reductionist thinking, right? What did we do? We said, choose a criteria. One is this, the other is this, and more, why are the criteria that you made your choice? But the point is that actually this is the first page of an introductory biology textbook. There is not a really satisfactory definition of life. And almost all textbooks still will say, well, life has these qualities sometimes, but not all the time. And non-life doesn't have these qualities most of the time, but sometimes they do, right? So like if you choose growth and development, well, a crystal does grow. What do we do about that? If you say, well, all life can reproduce, well, what about post-reproductive age or pre-reproductive age? Metabolism, cellular. All of this is to say, at least in a Western context, we've had this amazing study of life and a Western science context without a really good definition of life, or to be more specific, without a systems definition of life. And of course, to be speaking after Fritjof Capra is quite an honor, and we are taking a lot of our thinking, and he has done an amazing job of bringing all of this thoughts together in his incredible book, The Systems View of Life. And in particular, we want to point to Maturana and Varela's work, and they are often referred to as the Santiago School. And they were the first in a Western context to take this holistic or systems approach to this question of what is life. And what they did was they took a simple form of life, relatively simple, an E. coli bacteria, and they first started with a reductionist approach. They examined and mapped every single chemical, material, energetic pathway of that bacteria. And they found something amazing, which was that everything that is needed to maintain those pathways are actually generated by the bacteria itself, the cell itself, within its cell wall. And in this incredibly interdependent, interconnected way, everything that is created is reused. And all together, then it can actually self-maintain and self-regenerate. So the defining aspect of life, actually from the systems perspective, is that life currently is the only systems we see that can actually self-maintain and self-regenerate. And so many of us are using the term regenerative. We use the term regenerative to describe our work. And for us, it's actually synonymous then with life, that we can only be looking to life as a model if we're thinking about creating regenerative systems. The Maturana and Varela coined this beautiful term called autopoiesis, which is Greek for either self-poetry or self-making, to capture this set of interconnected phenomena. And so the definition of life then from the Santiago School is that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And as already mentioned, so for us, living is synonymous with regenerative. Regenerative is synonymous with living. They went on to ask some really also amazing questions that are really seminal when we're thinking about designing with life in mind. So they asked the question of, where is life? Where is this self-regenerative ability? Is it located in a particular system? Is it in one organ or another of the cell? And they found that it's not in any one place. It's actually dependent on all of these interconnected relationships of every part of the cell, all the energetic pathways, all the metabolic pathways. And so that life itself is actually a holistic and emergent property. You can't define life, and life can't function in a reductionist mindset. It can only be thought of as an emergent property of all the parts of the cell. and more importantly, all of the interrelationships of the cell. And of course, many of the organs and organelles of a cell the parts themselves are also autopoietic. They're also self-regenerated systems. They're wholes within wholes. Interesting question then is, well, what is death then, if we have this definition of life? And this is something that is still actually being researched in the process of what death is, particularly in complex forms of life. But what we do know is that death involves the lack of these relationships, the breaking of these interconnected relationships. A very interesting fact is that bacteria do not die of old age. They don't lose the ability to be self-regenerative. They lose food, or they have something happen to them, or they die of other reasons, but they don't just decay. They don't lose this ability, versus more complex forms, obviously like humans, we start losing this ability to self-regenerate. And it's very interesting to think about why. So if we take ourselves then as an example, then of course we can think of life as all the interconnected organs and parts of our human body, when they are functioning, when they can self-function, self-maintain, then life is, we'd say under this definition, that is life. Many of these organs we can keep alive artificially, right? Lungs, brains, but they can function with some external input, but they can't function on their own. And so this would be a state of dying. The other interesting insight from this work is that if this is what life is, then if life is self-regenerative within this boundary of its own making, what is its relationship to the stuff outside the boundary or its environment? And what's interesting is that this is also a place where that duality in itself is difficult to actually comprehend. And if we get out of that duality, this is a quote from Fritjof, saying there is no environment in some independent and abstract sense. Just as there's no organism without an environment, there's no environment without an organism. Because organisms don't only experience their environments and passively react to them, they also actively create them. And one of the most incredible examples of this is actually this Gaia theory, or the planet itself, from James Lovelock and then Margulis. And I was telling Roxy early on, I'm lucky enough, honored enough to have gotten to take a class within Margulis as an undergraduate at UMass. I was an undergraduate. I had no idea what she was saying most of the time, but somehow it filtered into my subconscious and later emerged as some kind of understanding. And those of you who are not familiar with this theory, it's the idea that the Earth itself is actually a self-regulating system. And how Lovelock and Margulis came to this was recognizing that if we look at the atmosphere of Earth in comparison to other planets, it's dramatically different. And the old hypothesis about this was the quote-unquote Goldilocks theory, right? That the Earth just happened to be the right amount of water, the exact distance from the sun, not too hot, not too cold, not too big, not too small, not too much water, not too little water. And what Lovelock and Margulis found was that actually if you take life off of Earth in a model, of course, and let a model run, its atmosphere will look incredibly similar to Venus and Mars. And so that what is creating the atmosphere itself on Earth is life itself. And in particular, if you look at the history of life on Earth, then the emergence of oxygen and life dependent on oxygen is a big piece of evidence in this, that life started anaerobic. Oxygen itself is a highly toxic, highly reactive gas. And so the fact that we have so much oxygen and nitrogen in our air is actually created by life itself. So on a whole planet level, this is an example of life creating the conditions for life. The other reflection about designing with life that is really powerful is that there is this, in general, this deep relationship between the resilience of a system and the diversity of that system, right? And there's, whether you look at highly diverse, species diverse ecosystems like coral reefs, whether we look at permaculture versus monoculture or multi-species cultures versus monocultures, we see a similar relationship. Or even if we look inside our own bodies, we see that the diversity of our gut microbiome is deeply linked to the resilience and health of our bodies. And it's not just diversity of things or species, but it's the diversity of relationships, right? And ecologists think of many different types of relationships in ecosystems, right? We can think of predator and prey, parasitism, but it's also, the idea that some relationships are neutral or amensal. There's a lot of focus in traditional Darwinian biology of competition being this driving force. But from an ecological perspective, it's great to remember that competition is actually minus. It's bad for both members of competition. There's less emphasis put on, the relationships of mutualistic relationships, which are plus. And again, back to the seminal work of Lynn Margulis and the idea of endosymbiosis, she showed that actually every single cell in our bodies and other multicellular animals or eukaryotic cell is actually a community. It's actually the coming together of one single living cells that came together in a community, and all of those interactive and interdependent relationships formed to form a new cell, which was then went through classic Darwinian natural selection over time to create what is now our modern cell. And this is the incredible seminal work of Margulis. So each of our cells is already in a autopoietic system. It is the creation of symbiotic mutualistic relationships. And there's a lot of more research, started by Margulis, showing the incredible importance of symbiotic relationships and mutualistic relationships in the creation of life. Some examples of this are gut microbes themselves, our own gut microbes. The only ability of a termite to be able to eat wood is through a symbiotic relationship, or the incredible mycelial relationships, networks of bacteria and algae and plants that actually form this incredible information network that's in every single part of our soils, wherever we are. So these are the key insights that we think are most relevant, or we try to keep in mind when designing with life. That life is, in fact, can only be understood as a holistic property, and that life is an organized system capable of self-regeneration within a boundary of its own making. That only living systems are regenerative. Regeneration is synonymous with living. That itself is emergent and decentralized. That life creates conditions for life, and that life is dependent on this wide diversity of interdependent relationships. And so if we go back to this idea of a metaphor for designing our organizations, and here is a Webster's dictionary definition of a machine. It says a machine is a structure that uses power to apply forces and control movement to perform an intended action. And if we just replace the word organization in this really describes many organizations, probably the dominant form of an organization. Unfortunately, all of us have probably been part of an organization that this fits, right? That an organization is a structure that uses power, often inequitable power, often extractive power, to apply forces and control the movement and thoughts and decisions and actions of people to perform an intended action, which is often just benefiting the few and not benefiting the whole. So if we replace that then with this definition of life from Maturana and Varela, we see something with a lot of potential, and this is what we're committed to. We see an organization as a living system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making, where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And this is what we are committed to at nRhythm, and this is what we hope to have an ongoing conversation with you all about. Just want to make a quick reference to what do we mean by this boundary of our own making, and how does that apply to social contexts or organizations, social organizations. Maturana Varela, of course, was looking at cells where the product of regeneration is biophysical. It's amino acids and atoms and molecules that are being recreated. And important to remember that this is a permeable boundary, or as Maturana and Varela put it, it's a boundary of identity, not a boundary of separation. And that, of course, do we recognize there are nested systems, there are holes within holes of this boundary. And we just want to point out that when we start thinking about that as a social system, then the element of regeneration is no longer biophysical. It's not atoms and molecules, but we see it as actually the element of regeneration is information. It's information that is creating the boundary. It's information in the form of our decisions and our actions, the norms and values we put together to say this is who we are and this is our purpose. But similarly, it is a permeable boundary that information flows in and out. And similarly, we see the boundary of an organization as a boundary of identity, not as a boundary of separation. But the boundary is key to identify, because without it, we can't think of regeneration. We can't think of autopoiesis. We can't define health. And what we think about a lot is that actually we are constantly creating and recreating this boundary. If we think about being in a social organization, even a small one, maybe even a pair, a relationship, every decision we make, every action we take, every exchange of information, we're actually constantly recreating this boundary. So what does this all mean then for creating organizations or changing or thinking about how we manage organizations? Now, I know many of us are artists in the design studio. I was always, I'm not an inherently talented illustrator or drawer. I went through lots of exercises like this as a kid to try to learn to draw, right? So many of us have gone through an exercise like this where we say how to draw an owl. Start with 2 circles, get a sense of a sketch. But it often feels like this, right? You just somehow go from the 2 circles to just draw the rest of the owl. And we see our commitment in this space is we really want to take this idea of designing with life in mind out of this context. Not just a great idea, not just a wonderful aspiration, but how do we actually get from the 2 circles to the whole owl when we think of designing with life in mind? And of course, this is our favorite quote and quote we use all the time. Of course, Buckminster Fuller recognized this with this quote saying, if you want to teach people a new way of thinking, don't bother trying to teach them. Instead, give them a tool, the use of which will lead to new ways of thinking. So I want to spend just a little bit of time describing some of the work of nRhythm, because this is how we think of our work. We think of what tools can we create that achieve this purpose for organizations. And so in general, we think of summarizing this design process in this way, that the traditional way of if we start with a machine as our model for design, then we engineer standard operating practices or best practices. And we take those and we adopt them, we try to enforce them into our local context, whether or not they were designed for that context. And if we force them a lot, or we've all been part of organizations that force them, we end up with some very prescriptive structures. And ultimately, we see this as degenerating the system, the original design. Versus if we start with living systems in mind, then we take our best understanding of living systems. And again, life is life. Everything we're presenting, all of this information, all of this great science, our own thinking about it is just our best estimation, our best understanding of how living systems work, but which are useful for us. So we say this informs then a set of design principles rather than a set of design practices. And those principles we use to facilitate a flexible framework that we can operate and make decisions on and manage with. And ultimately, we see this and hope that this regenerates the systems that we're part of, not just the organization, but the societies and communities that these systems are part of. Ultimately, this machine design, we know, depends on external inputs and more energy constantly being put into that process. Industrial agriculture is a great example of this. We can get great yields, short-term yields, but we constantly need to put more fertilizer, more pesticides, more external energy into that system because we're degrading from the inherent soil health that would create that productivity, or to create that productivity. Versus with living systems in mind, because living systems are self-maintaining, ultimately, if we design in this way, the system can maintain itself. And we recognize this needs tools, it needs shifts in perspectives and operations in how we get there. So I just want to present some of these tools that nRhythm is working on. So when we think of principles, I'll share these slides, and so I won't go through the long definitions, but the principles we recognize, and many of the speakers, many of you probably have different principles and patterns, and we just want to point out we don't believe these are the principles, but this is a set of principles, and hopefully they're meaningful to you. We'll introduce a Buddhist perspective here. There's a beautiful traditional Buddhist quote that says, "Don't confuse the moon with the fingers pointing at the moon." Meaning, life is life. We're offering these principles and patterns to as an attempt to say, if we are going to design like life, then what are those principles? But they're not life itself. Life is just simply is. But can we learn from it? What can we learn from it? So we think about designing our organizations to operate with a holistic principle, holism in mind, with interdependence in mind, recognizing the inherent value of all relationships, to recognize our unique context, both as individuals within the system and that each system is individual, and that how do we design our organizations to bring out that possibility of individual genius. We know that we need to design our organizations to be evolutionary and not just a Darwinian competition-based evolution, but a symbiotic evolution, an endosymbiotic evolution. So an evolution that recognizes the constant dynamic balance that a form of life is with its ever-changing condition, and that life actually affects those conditions and changes those conditions. We know that living systems don't tend to be centralized. They tend to be distributed, and information and resources tend to be equitably distributed across those systems, and that living systems change and grow. And so how do we design to allow that change and growth for all members of the system and all members of the organization? And then lastly, we'll present a tool which is we've developed what we call our regenerative framework, and we're often challenged by how to present this. And since I'm going to call out, since we have a group of artists here, group of designers, visual design is not our forte on the team. We know this is overly linear, but it's a great way to describe it. But if you can think of this as sort of an unfolded box, these are the different elements of the box, but ultimately we know we fold this back up to be a whole in some way. But we lead people through a design process, and we think of an organization then based on all those insights as needing to think about these key components. One is what we call the context. This involves traditional mission and vision, but it's deeper than that. It's our deep why. What's our deep shared purpose of coming together? And what is the quality of life we're creating together? And what are the behaviors we're committing to create that quality of life? And then what are all the nested systems we're a part of? To the far right is then why we are coming together. We see abundance and resilience and unleashing unlimited potential as the real reason why we're coming together for any endeavor. Just to the left of that then is what we tend to focus on in organizations, which is what work are we going to do? What is the things we're going to do? So strategic planning, products and programs, technology and tools, what short-term outcomes. All of this, of course, is important to try to achieve anything, but we see work as the meaningful expression of our context. It is the emergent property of what it is ultimately what creates abundance and resilience, but we tend to be overly focused on just thinking if we just create the work, then we'll achieve that. And so we, of course, come from a regenerative agriculture background, many of us. The analogy we often make is often when there's a problem in an organization, we think we can just replace work. We just need new strategies, new products and programs. But this would be like just changing the crop, changing from corn to wheat or wheat to rice, or just changing what we're growing without looking at the inherent health of that soil, thinking there's a problem, we're not getting the yield we want, let's just change what we're doing. And so what is that inherent health of the soil then? Those are the middle two pillars of this. First is we think the same way that an ecosystem has inherent processes for health, nutrient cycling, water cycling, energy cycling. We see all organizations as having 4 key processes of health. So you can think of these as the ecosystem dynamics of organizations. First and foremost is we see the energy of an organization as its people. And so the people need to thrive to have energy in that system. The second is the same way that nutrients need to cycle, there needs to be a death and decay process of nutrients in any living system. Again, since information is the key element of a social system, we see information as needing to go through a similar cycling. We call this the information cycle or the informational life cycle. We're often asking organizations we work with, what assumptions, what processes, what old ideas need to die so that those ideas and information can be recycled and reorganized to give life to something else. The third component is the communication exchange. Again, we know that for everything needs to be interconnected for a system to be healthy. And then it's communication that is passing information from one part of a system to another. And then, of course, we recognize that we need a diverse set of relationships, deeply interconnected relationships in that network for any living system. And then the middle pillar of this framework then is all organizations need some kind of structures, right? Governance structures, decision-making structures, meeting structures, roles and responsibilities. We need some level of design, but often those structures are designed only with work in mind, right? We're gonna create sales bonuses to drive more work, or we're going to create meeting structures to make sure we can be efficient. We spend a lot of time saying, how do we design structures first and foremost to create health in the system, and secondarily from health be able to be a platform for work. So again, we see going back to an agriculture or garden analogy is the structures we create have to create soil health first. From soil health, creating healthy soil, we know we can design all kinds of work that will be meaningful and be an expression of our context. And just want to end then with, well, what is the potential here? What do we really mean by creating potential and abundance and resilience? We have a close connection to the Savory Institute, who's been seminal in creating a framework for managing land in a holistic way and with a living systems approach. And so this is a slide we borrowed from them. This is a piece of land that was managed with this type of thinking, with this framework. And the next slide you'll see has no external inputs in it whatsoever. So in a 4-year period, using this holistic approach, this piece of land was transformed into this. So there's no external water, no external seeds. Everything, all of the potential that is in this slide is expressed in this slide. And so our deep commitment is, when we think of our social organizations, then if we try to think of managing our organizations, how very broadly defined, and designing our organizations, is how do we see this, understand the unlimited potential that's in this, and manage it, organize it, and design it in a way to release this type of abundance. And what does that look like for each of our contexts in the social context? I'm going to skip ahead, actually, because I want to leave lots of time for some questions. But just wanted to present a couple of opportunities if you want to engage with us further. So one is, we run a series of webinars that we call design sprints, where we tackle a complex issue and apply this framework and thinking through an interview process to address this. So our next one is coming up March 10th, where we're going to be looking at what does it look like to really regenerate democracy in the US. Something that's probably top of all of our minds. And this is with an organization called Represent Us, which is a bipartisan organization that's been working on democracy reform. And I saw a couple, see some of our community of practice and some alumni here, but we also run a deeper design lab or deeper course. Next one is coming up in March as well. This is a 4-week online course, about 4 hours a week. And it's anyone interested in applying these ideas or looking at these ideas further. This is a peer-to-peer learning environment. We try to describe it like a woodworking class, where you show up and you're creating your thing. So whether it's whatever your organization is or how you wish to use the framework, we're leading you through a process that I described with this framework for you to design something that whatever your regenerative idea is, how to bring that to life. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Roxy and Faith, and would love to know your questions and answer anything I can.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is amazing. It's such an incredible privilege for us to get to see how you've applied these principles and supported so many organizations and structures to really embed them into the way that they're retooling and rethinking, which is really what we're all about in the Design Science Studio and BFI and in the Living Systems Collaboratory. And it's the first cohort of the studio is really kind of nearing the close of the first chapter of the decade, and so really getting to see how some of these principles can be applied and digging in even more depth through your own lens is really so rich. And there's a lot of really great questions that have come through. And I'll put the first one up from Casey House, who's actually one of the Living Systems Art and Design Collaboratory members, who's working on Synergetics University. So it's actually an educational platform to support people learning about synergetics, and it's really incredible. He's a designer and artist, and he asks, how do we encourage multi-billion-dollar corporations to have regeneration, resilience, consideration, living systems thinking as integral parts of their operating systems?
It's a great question. I'll address it on a couple different levels. Of course, we know that this shift that we are all a part of is a complex issue itself, right? And so we know that this takes many, many different approaches, and many of us working on different contexts. And so it may be the multi-billion-dollar corporations that may change last in this, or will take the longest, will definitely take time to shift. I think in the context of someone referred to hospicing and referred to Margaret, actually I have the book right here. Yeah, Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fry's framework. I think it's a beautiful framework for change that really addresses this, which is what does it look like for a massive system, our economic systems, our corporate systems to change. And they identify, maybe we'll put it as a link, they identify some key roles that different organizations and individuals can take. And I think it's a beautiful framework that we need inspiration, we need new models. We also need the heroes that are part of the old system that are advocating for the new system. And we need the, roles to play hospice to those most affected by the old system collapsing and to the old system itself. I think it's a beautiful concept. At the same time, I'll address the question of something we're really committed to doing this, and we've been in some conversations with some multi-billion-dollar corporations. And so we are really committed to translating some of this language to something that is authentic and meaningful, but is also understandable in that context. And we have found the idea of health to be really a good translator. That obviously, if I have a chance to sit down with the CEO of a large company, I probably won't give them a 45-minute lecture on bacteria and autopoiesis. But if I talk to them about how do you create a healthy organization, how do you create long-term abundance and health, and what does organizational health look like? And one thing I skipped for time is we've developed a tool called the Organizational Health Index, which is a monitoring tool, an assessment tool that we've applied to some pretty traditional organizations. So one thing that we're very committed to as nRhythm is really working across all sectors. And we are working with some manufacturing organizations, some architecture, law firms, a lot of industries that one may not immediately think would have come to us with a regenerative approach in mind. But when we apply the idea of health and how do we operate in a healthier way, how do we manage in a way for long-term possibilities, that seems to resonate. And I'll say one last thing to this question, it's a great question, is we also tend to think of large corporations as networks. We approach them as a network. There's many different parts of that corporation once it gets a certain size. And so how do we approach it with a network leadership approach, a network change approach?
Beautiful. We had one of the amazing visionaries who came to speak to the studio, Lynn Twist, and her second session that she did with us, she was talking also about hospicing the old, but also like doing it with dignity, like honoring it for the place that it held, and then helping it kind of compost and reconsider and re-see, a different way forward. Shortly after, Ben Haggard from Regenesis came to speak, and a lot of the work that they've done, kind of the applied regenerative frameworks, is not about like you said, it's not like let's give you the 45-minute lecture about bacteria and systems and let's like tell you how it is. It's more about like identifying, the things that they care about, like the health of their system, and helping them see a new way forward that builds on the lessons they learned, and actually helps usher a new path. So,
yeah, absolutely. I love that. I'd love to build on one comment on that, which is we were actually just in a call yesterday with we'll announce it soon, but we're in partnership with a university in India that is bringing a regenerative approach, and particularly what wisdom is there in the traditional Indic philosophies of India that can be applied, that are really congruent with regeneration. They're seeing more and more effects of a Western colonial approach to management and design. And I was amazed by the person we're working with, and they have seen all kinds of value. They've seen both the really extractive aspects of what we've talked about today, but they saw a certain value in this traditional corporate culture of the West. And I was making fun of like power yoga, right? That if we compare like what yoga's become in a fitness studio to its deep wisdom traditions, and he had this amazing view that you just mentioned, where he said, yeah, but the amazing thing that the West does and the US does really well is takes something and makes it a commodity in a good way and makes it available to lots and lots of people. Of course, what doesn't work for it is that it breaks the lineage and tradition and the wisdom that was originally part of it. And I just thought that was a beautiful example of what you just said, Roxy, of, yeah, what can we learn, including this mechanistic model? What can we take from the old but really allow it to be reorganized in a new way?
Beautiful. I'm excited about this new partnership. Sounds really one of the things that we're really passionate about. One of the team members of the studio, Samantha Sapaya, she's really building bridges for regeneration in the global south. And I think that weaving forward and trying to not have like such a primarily global north perspective on regeneration is so integral for our path forward. So really excited about that collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next question comes from Linda Booth Sweeney, who is also, the people in the studio are amazing, but her work is, I think you would really love. She's taking living systems principles and making them into cards also for like youth learning. She's also making augmented reality gamified apps. So really trying to take some of these principles and make them really accessible, and has written multiple books and just is amazing. Well, happy to connect to you afterwards. So Linda asks if you could speak more about the negative aspects of mechanistic metaphors as they contribute to infant mortality rates.
Wow, that's a great question. I think there would be a number of different factors in that. I mean, of course, one thing we didn't mention is this mechanistic approach to health in general, and medicine, of course, is probably one of the most detrimental or most limited applications of thinking of health, thinking of the human body, thinking of disease, and thinking of in this very mechanistic approach, right? Of course, it does some amazing things, but at the same time, many of us, I'm sure, are all personally touched by the limitations of Western science in treating our own well-being and our health. Infant mortality, of course, is more than just a health concern. Of course, it's a societal concern, and all of the social determinants of health. And so I would say it's contributing, that mechanistic metaphor, as it contributes to planet, as it contributes to racial equity and racial inequities, as it contributes to economic inequalities, all the ways we sort of presented at that high level of this talk, of course, all contribute to something like infant mortality, which is a culmination of all of that. And that's why we see, why we mention it as such a dominant metaphor, because it pervades how we approach all of these aspects of our lives. And one of the reasons why nRhythm is so committed to organizations is because we see the change of that, of all of those systems. Of course, they're nested. Of course, there has to be things done at scale and at policy levels, but ultimately we see it as groups of people needing to organize themselves for change. And so we see organizational design at the heart of all of that change.
Beautiful. We're running out of time. There's so many good questions. I think a kind of practical, and thank you so much for speaking to that. Last question, almost like practical application and wisdom sharing question that comes from Ada Paris, another incredible creator in the studio who's doing a lot of work around decolonialization and kind of giving immersive experiences that help us to really embody some of the principles. Asks who or which team, department in the organization is the entry point to start having these kinds of conversations?
I'm interpreting the question as like, where is our entry point into the organizations we work with?
So. Yeah, the one that you work with to specifically help with this organizational redesign, regenerative.
Okay, great. Because if it's who to talk to at nRhythm, please talk to any of us. We'd love to connect with you all. So it's not there's not an entry point with us to have conversations, but it's how are we sparking these conversations? We're tending, it's really diverse. We're tending to work with, most of our work is with sort of small to medium organizations up to about 500 employees. And what has worked is, whether it is a particular area, department, or whether it's a whole organization, is someone who is a decision maker for the design of that area. The one thing I think we can find multiple entry points into organizations. The one place that tends to have led to a faster maybe silo is if we're not someone from the department, but if the work we're doing is seen as just HR, as this is great for employees. Of course, we should think about employee health or employee thriving. That's a great entry point, but we try to move it very quickly to, this isn't about benefit programs or incentives. This is about managing and organizing in a deeply, fundamentally different way. It's how you operate together as an organization. A related question, we're often asked, what is a prerequisite of people doing this work? Have we found any? And it's not industry specific. What we have found as a prerequisite is the idea of emergence. The idea that you can invest in conditions, invest in health, and that there is something you can't quite know yet or can't quite measure yet that is really abundant and really resilient. And we may use different words for that. We might talk about potential or health or long-term health, but definitely folks who are just like, I want to drive efficiency, I want to measure KPIs, and I want to, if that is their measure of success in this only, we can use that. We can start there. Oh, great to hear it. Yeah, we find that absolutely. So we try to at least bring someone else in addition to HR, so we're not just siloed as something that's seen as just that. And if you're working on, racial equity issues and decolonization change, we found that to be the same as well. Like to get an organization, we have a couple partnerships and clients where we're also working with sort of a race equity lens first, and to be able to shift them. That this absolutely, of course, it's important to have trainings. It's important for employees to understand privilege and bias, but what we really want to get to is, how are you operating equitably? How are you actually being an equitable organization internally? And that's often a harder conversation. And of course, for those of you who are working in this area, means we have to start talking about power redistribution and power equity, and that's a very different conversation that, and often one that needs more engagement.
Just a quick follow-up to that. How heavy in your experience, does the education or kind of embodied, maybe just moments for people to relearn, rethink, when does that kind of come in? I imagine it's once you're in through the door of let's think about the health and redesign, it's actually we're going to get to retool the way that we're looking at this. Ada was sharing with us yesterday that as whenever she's doing this work with corporations, often she ends up getting to talk to them about the history of colonization, and then the history of racism rather, and that becomes a sort of educational entry point. And just curious, what frames does nRhythm take when it comes to that layer of learning forward together with these organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say we're on our own journey of committing more and more to have understanding what's the minimum, in many ways, what's the minimum of what I've just presented here that we need to share to get people involved of wanting to change in their own context, and then sharing the most relevant pieces of information as a tool for that change. So I'd say, we've probably made early mistakes we've made is thinking, especially, often I describe myself as a recovering academic, right? And so I can't help sometimes just think, oh, I'm going to download all this information for you, and from that you'll make a set of behavior changes or decisions. I left academia in my bio because I came to the hard realization that very, very, very few people in the world change behaviors or change habits, especially based on information. Mm-hmm. So our commitment is, how do we create more and more experiences that are where people can entry from their own wishes, their own needs, their own context, and then we provide information as a tool for their own context and their own change.
Yeah, that's really a lot of the heart of what we're up to, is like empowering art and design as such an important tool for catalyzing social change through experience, because it is really through embodied experience that people can have those transformational moments, and not by being told, but by feeling. So I'm sure there's exciting ways that we can collaborate too with some of the amazing designers that we have to be of support and for some of these initiatives moving forward.
Yes, we would love that. And please, open invitation for, if this was meaningful for anyone here, please reach out. We'd love to continue a conversation with everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. And for anyone who is just tuning in, we are at the end of our wonderful talk with Jeff Su from nRhythm. And this has been a powerful guest seminar with Jeff, and we've been exploring what is life. And this is all a part of the Living Systems Art and Design Collaboratory, which is a part of the Design Science Studio, a program of the Buckminster Fuller Institute in Virtual. The creative outputs of this decade-long program, it's a decade-long anticipatory art and design-driven incubator for revolutionary creators that are working to articulate a world that works for all life. We're implementing Buckminster Fuller's comprehensive anticipatory design science principles in alignment with the decade. So over the course of the decade, we'll have over 2,000 creators who are building culture-shifting projects that accelerate solutions for a world where all beings thrive. And the Collaboratory is supporting about 30 creators whose work is focused primarily on living systems. And so it's been such a delight to have Jesu here with us today as we kind of weave together, promoting the power of art and design, these designed experiences that you all are facilitating too. As we know, it's this cross-cultural language for systemic change. And the studio has this mission of kind of guiding and empowering voices that believe that a better world is possible. And so your voice with us today, Jeff, has been such a gift. And we are excited to weave with you for this decade as the studio is kind of designed to help engineer new visions of what's possible in partnership with thought leaders like yourself, different organizations and initiatives that are working for a future that is regenerative and just for all. So we thank you for your time today and look forward to more. And yeah, thank you from all of us. And we hope that you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roxy. And again, a real honor to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.